quote-unquote enemy, one that does not condone violence as a form of communication. Such voices are rarely heeded, and until we learn once again to speak in our own voice and reject that handed to us by the state in times of war, we flirt with it. And of course now the times of war have just become endless. There is no time of peace that we know, really.
Still make really major impacts on the direction of their country. Not that we shouldn't be mobilizing just in elections, but I think that we have to always remember the je ne sais quoi between the street and the ballot box when we put these things together. So I'll just close there. I'm really looking forward to hearing folks' questions and comments and other things like that. And I think this is a great panel of people with the great moderators. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Real quick, Eugene, speaking of a great panel of people, can you mention you have a show on Sputnik, just all the things you've done real quick?
Sure. So I have a show called By Any Means Necessary. We're everywhere. We're produced by Radio Sputnik. We're on 105.5 FM in DC. If you like to listen to the radio in your car, I know that's kind of old-fashioned, but hey. We're there. We're on iTunes. We're on Spreaker. The content of the show, I guess, is like the content of my life. It's mainly people doing different social justice work. Mattia Benjamin is often on our show in different areas. Our sort of feeling is that we wanted to have a core and kind of the movement for Black Lives generation demographic, but also really get a broader sort of left-leaning public affairs piece out there, and so we try to just find people whose voices we think are really valuable or whose work we think is really important that just don't get on CNN all the time, and ask them about that, but also ask them what they think about other things. I mean, it's surprising to me how often it's easy for like a young activist to get on TV to talk about like what they're doing around policing, but no one ever really asked them, well, what do you think about the escalation in Afghanistan or something. Also try to give space for people to show that they have a much broader range than just the issues that they're pigeonholed into, and so for people who I guess are thinking, what are all these like crazy young millennials talking and thinking and caring about? We try to offer some answers to that question in the nature and the content of the show. I also work with a group called the Stop Police Terror Project DC. It's part of the Movement for Black Lives Steering Committee here. I think the name is pretty self-explanatory. And I also do a lot of work around gentrification issues here in DC with a group called Justice First, and also One DC, Organizing for Neighborhood Equity DC. So I try to embody in my activities exactly what I said there in the beginning of not keeping things in silos and trying to connect and cross over as many movements as we can to build something more progressive and more powerful.
And a number of us went over onto the eastern shore of Maryland. But anyway, what we are looking at now is, and I've been trying to come to grips with it myself, what is lacking that we don't have this focus on what limits? You can't raise it on not worry about Fox, MSNBC, or CNN. And they're just such idiots. They've got these talking heads that are, it's ridiculous. Anyway, the thing on the bases. I talked to Americans about 800 bases around the world. They don't believe me. Do you think most Americans know there are 800 bases around the world?
They don't know.
They don't know. So, and nobody's telling them. The other thing is we've got these hot spots, disaster in Yemen, cholera, devastation in the countries that we have invaded and destroyed. We have destroyed them. If you see the pictures of Aleppo, my God, victory in Aleppo. Did you see those signs? Victory in Aleppo, a devastated city. 16 years in Afghanistan, and no mass movement. People, we have to deal with this. We have got to deal with this in a massive way. There is amnesia in the population about the role of the Democratic Party. Everybody conveniently forgets about Obama and his program to have $1 trillion go into rebuilding the nuclear power, weaponry. Silence. Nothing. Why? Because it was Obama. And I'll tell you right now, if Hillary had won, all the movements you see going on right now would be quiet. They've got this wonderful two-party game working, and it works for them perfectly. So we have to bust that up. Now, when we talk of a third party, it has to confront the issue of war and the military budget. The Green Party does that. A little bit more about myself. I was in all the mass movements, civil rights, women's movement. I went to England on a speaking tour for abortion. I've been a trade union representative in AFSCME, my union. I'm now a retiree. And over the years, I was building all these movements, and I finally came to the conclusion, I don't have a party to vote for in the election. I'm doing all this work. What am I doing? You know, because it comes down, we just put the same old people back in. So I did build a huge umbrella coalition that took people in on the basis of out now, withdraw the troops, bring the troops on that. We didn't ask that you agree on this country or that country or whatever. We wanted to get the troops home. And the reason that was successful because there was one socialist group, the Socialist Workers' Party and the YSA, which has never gotten credit for it by any left commentary, that put that thing together year after year after year after year and kept people in the streets on the single issue of the war, and actually built the SMC, the new mobilization committees, and so on. Today we have 3 anti-war coalitions. Answer? The National Peace Action Coalition, or what is it? No, the United National Anti-War Coalition. And the third one is the Peace and Justice, United for Peace and Justice. So now you have 3 different coalitions that refuse to work together, quite frankly. How can we get them to do that? We got to demand they do it. We have to put pressure on them and scandalize them and say, you have got to work together like we did in the 60s and put your own little agendas and your own little recruitment efforts aside for the greater good. That's how you do it. And if we do that, we will be successful in, again, reactivating people around the key issue for our country, which is to stop this horrible attack on the rest of the world. Now, I've been trying to do that. I know how hard it is. So say it doesn't happen. My alternative, and I'm going to end with this, is that if we can't build that umbrella, massive anti-war coalition, we have to take the anti-war issue into all the other mass movements. For instance, the Women's March didn't have an anti-war position. Why? Because it was influenced by the Democratic Party, which will not discuss it. Doesn't allow discussion of the war and the military budget. But that march, that Women's March, should have been an anti-war march. Okay, say it isn't officially. We come with anti-war contingents on all these marches, whether it's immigration, Black Lives Matter, whatever. It's up to the left to raise the issue of the war in our signs, in our banners, building contingents, so that people will make those links. In the meantime, until we can again bring everyone together under an umbrella that is saying no to war, no more war. Thank you.
So Linda brought up the issue of the division in the anti-war movement. Some of it is related to real differences in opinion. For example, the anti-war movement, as small as it has been since the time Obama came in, has been very divided about Syria. There are also a lot of divisions around there have been big divisions over the years about Afghanistan, with some of the mainstream women's movements saying this was a way to liberate women in Afghanistan, and even to this day saying that if the U.S. troops pulled out, the Taliban would come back in and women would be back in their burqas. This is something we have to talk about as a movement and be clear that invasion by the U.S. and occupation is not liberation for local people. And then there are just the realities that there isn't a draft like there was when we were younger, where everybody was affected by the wars. The powers that be that run this we're in the war machine figured out a long time ago. Keep the wars on the low, on the lowdown. And after 9/11, we're involved in 7 wars, and the majority of people have no idea. It's not just about the bases. They don't know that we're engaged in these wars. It's like a low-grade fever that, especially for young people, they've been brought up with the U.S. is at war, and this is part of what's become the norm. So there are a lot of structural issues as well as ideological issues that we have to come together about. And but I do believe there is a very widespread anti-war sentiment within the American public. And we saw that in the fact that Obama had an edge over Hillary because he was clearly against the invasion of Iraq. We saw that in the statements that Trump made during his campaign that got a lot of support from people when he said the U.S. shouldn't be engaged in interventions overseas in nation building, and came across as an anti-interventionist. Of course, as soon as he got into power, he changed his tune, bringing on all these generals and getting more deeply involved in the wars that we're already in. There were 2 major achievements under the Obama administration in a mostly horrendous global policy, and those were lessening the embargo on Cuba and establishing diplomatic relations, and the Iran deal. Let's look right now. Trump comes in, he squeezes Cuba again, and right now, as Cuba is being pummeled by Hurricane Irma, I think this is a really good time for us to come back and say it is time to lift the embargo so that we can work together with the Cubans and the other people in the Caribbean and Florida to rebuild from the devastation of this hurricane. The other is the Iran nuclear deal, and it has actually been coming out from the Trump administration that they are looking for a way to say that Iran is not complying with this deal. And Iran is complying with the deal, but they, come hell or high water, are going to find a way to say no. And I think behind all of this, because if the U.S. pulls out, there are still other countries that are party to this agreement. What they really are, the strategy, I think, is to try to make it so difficult for the more moderate Iranians by strengthening the sanctions against Iran that the hardliners in Iran will win out and they will pull out of the deal, which would be disastrous. So we've got to really build among what we have in the anti-war movement, as well as those people that in Congress who don't want to see us pull out of the Iran deal, to try to keep in that. Meanwhile, there's another flashpoint, and that is Korea. I came back recently from South Korea. I had been before 2 years ago with a group called Women Cross the DMZ. We went from North Korea to South Korea. An amazing opportunity to meet with women's groups on both sides of the border. I firmly believe that it is going to be women, and now we're talking particularly about the Korean Peninsula, that is going to pull us out of this disaster if indeed we can get out of it. The South Koreans that I met with recently have so many civic organizations and grassroots groups, and I think, Eugene, you were referring, I don't know, were you referring to their upheaval that got the disastrous Park regime out and put in a new president who has now been under a lot of pressure to go along with the U.S. militarism. And it's a very dangerous time because the war machine is coming in there now and saying that this is a time that we have to give more sophisticated military equipment to South Korea and to Japan, both countries where people have risen up to say, no, we don't want to be part of this U.S. militarization. So I think the Korean Peninsula issue is a really, really dangerous one. But we do have a chance in this case to hook up with groups. It's very difficult in the North because it's a top-down, totally top-down situation. But in the South, there are groups that we can be in solidarity with, and we must be in solidarity with. We have to also point out the terrible hypocrisy. While we don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons, we don't want anybody to have nuclear weapons. And we've got 6,800 of them. And so most of the rest of the world sees this hypocrisy. And let's be clear that North Korea is very cultish, top-down regime. It is not a crazy regime, and the leaders are not crazy. And in fact, they are very sane in their plan, looking at and articulating the fact that other countries like Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya were overthrown precisely because they did not have their nuclear weapons. And so if there is a chance for easing of the tensions, it's through something that's called a freeze for a freeze. Have you heard of this? So a freeze for a freeze is that the North Koreans would put a freeze on future testing of nuclear weapons as well as missiles, while the U.S. and South Korea would put a freeze on the military exercises that they conduct. These military exercises are seen by the North Koreans as practice for invasion. In fact, they're talked about in terms of decapitation of the North Korean regime. What North Korea wants is not to send a nuclear weapon to the United States or Japan or Guam. What the North Korean government wants is to stay in power. And if they can be assured that we are not going to go in and overthrow them, they have indicated in the past a willingness to look at a freeze for a freeze. This has been something proposed by the Russians and the Chinese, and it's something that we need to push here in the United States. And then just a couple of other things. How many of you have been paying attention to what's happening in Burma right now? Well, it's a genocide that's going on against the Muslim population, Rohingya. And there was a demonstration that was called yesterday in front of the Burmese embassy. And it was very sad to me because it was quite a large crowd of exclusively Muslims, except for 5 of us in Coatpink that showed up. Where is the anti-war movement? Where is the support for a Muslim community that is being destroyed? And where does this image come that we don't care about Muslims, if even within our own progressive community we can't get people out to say, stop the genocide of the Rohingya? Then there's the issue that Linda referred to of Yemen, which is a country that is being absolutely destroyed by the Saudis with U.S. weapons, U.S. logistical support, U.S. diplomatic cover. We must do something more to come out. Every time we've called demonstrations about Yemen or demonstrations at the Saudi embassy, we've had maybe 20, 30 people show up to them. I will give you an opportunity, and that is Monday. Monday is 9/11. Remember 9/11? 16 years, 9/11. There will be a protest at the Saudi embassy at noon on Monday. Any of you who can make it, that would be wonderful, or tell your friends. It is a chance to say, we still don't know the involvement of Saudi Arabia in 9/11 attack, and we would like to know that. It is a chance to say, we don't want our government being complicit with all of the crimes that Saudi Arabia is guilty of, internally as well as externally, exporting their extremist version of Islam, Wahhabism around the world, making it look bad for all Muslims around the world. And so please, if you can, join us. And then finally, I want to say that it is so difficult in this political situation, as it was under Obama, to do work in Congress or with the White House or through the State Department to try to pull the U.S. from all of these entanglements. And so a number of our organizations are launching a campaign to say, okay, let's look at who is really benefiting from all of these wars, and that is the weapons makers. Yep. So starting in October, and I invite you to either come or watch it live streamed, we're going to be doing a launch October 21st and 22nd of a campaign called Divest from the War Machine. We're going to ask cities and universities and faith-based organizations and pensions to pledge that they will take out their money or will not invest in the war machine. And that includes Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, these big companies that put so much money into lobbying of our government officials and are really the ones that make a killing out of killing. So let's get our money out of the war machine. Thank you.
All great points, I want to ask a question, start with a question about media and how much the impact it has on the fact that our country has such a small anti-war movement, or at least a sheepish one, I guess. I don't know how to describe it, but our media is a travesty on all levels. The mainstream media, it seems like a mockery of itself some of the time. I mean, they have gone after Trump largely rightfully on just about every issue, but there's one thing that they have rewarded him and lauded him for, and that was bombing Syria or selling arms to Saudi Arabia. That is the only thing where they come out of the woodwork and they're like, now he's presidential. That's our guy. And it's so sad to see. I mean, on that night when they started bombing Syria, remember, like they were giddy. I mean, they were excited. Brian Williams turned poetic. He was like, "Look at the beauty of our weapons." It was disgusting to see. And you know, there's a lot of reasons for this. You know, one of them you were talking about the weapons contractors. The amount of money they either own these channels or they buy so much advertising, which I mentioned last night. And why do you think there are ads for, like, you know, Lockheed Martin F-35s or whatever on CNN? It's not because a grandmother in Poughkeepsie might pick one up. You know, let's try and advertise out to the people of America. We want them to buy some Abrams tanks. No, it's because they want to influence these networks. And if they're given a lot of money for commercials, then they can influence them very easily. And I will give one hopeful thought on our media, and then I want to hear your take on it. The fact that in order to have a bigger and more powerful anti-war movement, people need to understand the humanity of the other side, which I think alternative media is achieving that. And it's a relatively slow process, although if you look on the scope of time, it's incredibly quick. But it's a process of getting people to understand that, like, North Korea is not Kim Jong-un. It's a bunch of, you know, it's millions of people that are wonderful people. It's the same with Russia and the same with Iran, and yet we're told just to look at these countries as their leader. Whether you hate them or not, it's as if they're one thing. But thanks to social media, we are starting to realize the humanity of all these other nations and how silly this jingoism and xenophobia is. And so I think that's a hopeful aspect of where our, at least, alternative media is going. And I want to get your thoughts on the media and everything, starting with Eugene.
Oof, that's a big commentary. I don't know, am I part of the media now? That's scary. Yeah, you know, I think you make a great point there too, Lee, in terms of the impact of advertising. I think the other thing, especially just in the context now where, you know, media, the landscape is so much more fractured, the people are competing. I think, and Medea, I'd love your thoughts on this in some ways. I think most people who report on quote-unquote national security issues are essentially captured by the national security establishment because they're locked into this thing of access journalism. I mean, all journalists, especially in the 24-hour news cycle, you want to get it, not all, but certainly in the mainstream, you want to get as many clicks, as many views, as many whatever, right? You want to have the first scoops, you want to have the earliest scoops, and the CIA knows that, the NSA knows that, the Pentagon knows that, and you don't have to look very deeply if you want to look at the history of how they interact with the media, but they are laundering. I mean, if you look at the quote-unquote Russia investigation, I mean, obviously the major media has been used to launder the different theories and agendas of different elements of the, elements of the government, both for and against Trump, and these just outlandish claims, but no one wants to be last. Everyone wants to be first. Everyone wants the clicks. And when you're in that kind of atmosphere, it breeds a sort of, I think, groupthink. It's exactly why the Pentagon went to embedded journalists, because they said our problem in Vietnam is people were just getting on helicopters and jumping off and talking to people without any minders around them, and they're learning the the truth. So they came up in Iraq, this is documented, with this idea of embedded journalists so they could control the story that was coming out of the war zone. And when your life appears to be dependent on a certain group of people, you better believe you're going to see it the same way the 3rd Marines do, because if the 3rd Marines don't like you, you might not make it out of there. And I think we don't talk enough about how sophisticated the government is at recognizing the war-making and intelligence parts of it, of recognizing what the sort of political economy imperatives are of the media and using their sort of sourcing to cultivate certain individuals and to get them to say certain things. Glenn Greenwald wrote a good article about this once, about the NPR like national security reporter who actually said once, well, you know, they can't reveal all this stuff. So because if they revealed it all, you know, America would be taken down. So you just have to trust me that what they're showing me is like what's really going on, and I wouldn't lie to you. Well, what makes you think that they aren't lying to you, right? I think that's a huge piece. And I do actually think, for sure, when we talk about journalists, we often have to remember that, like, they are also people. And so all of the prejudices and biases and other things that exist in our society that most people have, they also have. Except the difference is journalists view themselves as extremely well-informed about all issues at all times, and thus are less willing to examine their own bias, which I think is a lot of the journalistic intensity against Trump. I think is also sort of a knee-jerk reaction to the fact that Trump has actually exposed there's a huge number of people who don't believe the media. And I think that's upset them. And I think the fact that he has eliminated the monopoly of truth that the media tried to create for itself has made him a much bigger enemy than any of his policies to the media and the way that they deal with him. And I just close by saying it's obviously intentional. Every journalist in D.C. knows who Medea Benjamin is. Most of them know who I am. The only time I get called by the Washington Post is if it's a cop kills somebody or maybe the 4th odd story about someone being displaced from an apartment building and they want my thoughts. But they know I have thoughts about Afghanistan and intelligent thoughts, and then I can say something about it. But obviously that would extremely disrupt the status quo, so they're going to have someone from the Brookings Institution who's going to say the same thing that everyone else is saying. I was once on headline news after the Obama didn't bomb Syria at the time, and they gassed me up. They're like, this is amazing. It's been crazy to see how it seems like public opinion has turned. We want to have you on for like 15 minutes and just have this whole conversation about what's going on and why people are upset. They asked me one question. So we're 45 seconds in. I give like a 30-second answer because it's headline news. You got to go fast. And they're like, and we're cutting to commercial now. And the person came on and was like, you were great. Thanks for coming. We'll call you later. Never heard from them. So like, obviously, it's intentional to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it has gotten much worse, especially since Trump has taken office. But it's been bad to Obama, too, because they covered up his role totally. The reason that nobody was out in the streets protesting is that you weren't allowed to criticize Obama and the NAACP. The other black organizations fell in with that. The first black president, we can't say anything. And the other thing is that at one point, about the time that they got rid of Chris Hedges, they got rid of all the independent journalists all over the country. Chris Hedges used to be a respected journalist, and he made one statement they didn't like, and he was out the door. And everybody else got the message. The ones they didn't get rid of, everybody else got the message. You have this narrow range you can speak in, and don't go beyond or you're going to lose your job. And they did. They lost their jobs. And then, after the 60s, they learned the power of the media. And that's when they bought it up. That's when the corporate media became this massive entity that can control all the outlets. That wasn't the case. Remember when there were numerous network outlets before, and they said, oh my God, if we show bodies coming back from Vietnam and the pictures, remember the kids running down the street, or even that famous picture I'll never forget, remember when they put the flowers in the rifles at the Pentagon during the Pentagon March? When those kind of images get out to the public, Americans are basically good people if they get the information.
Yeah.
They know that. So they're not going to let them get the information. And And this is why we have to protect the internet like crazy.
Yeah.
They are already trying. They've made attempts.
Yeah.
We have to fight on that one. And some people told me that they already think that the left sites are getting slowed down. You know, I mean, they have control. We don't have any control. So we've got to be vigilant on that score. The other thing is to build alternative media. I am, for one, have not been that supportive. Democracy Now! Is an outlet. But I also feel Democracy Now! Has a certain range that's acceptable. And what I mean by that is one thing we learned in the course of the anti-war movement in the 60s was that the anti-war movement started out being for negotiations. I don't know how many of you know this. But that was the demand of the liberal anti-war pacifists. And there was a huge fight that took place basically because the socialists and the left wing had to fight to have withdrawal of troops be the demand. We fought for out now. And it was a big fight. It took place over at least 3 years until we finally won the position on Vietnam of withdrawal of troops. And that was because we had to fight for the principle of self-determination. We had to establish with Americans who are brainwashed that we have the right to go anywhere in the world and impose our will. Manifest destiny, the Monroe Doctrine. Americans think it's okay that we're somehow in South Korea. What are the Americans doing in North and South Korea? That war ended. It ended in an armistice, not a peace treaty. We should have withdrawn from South Korea. We don't belong there. We have nothing to say about what goes on in North and South Korea, my friends. And calling for negotiations is giving in to the imperialists, that we have some kind of right to say what goes on. Now, in Korea, there were numerous attempts for the North and South to negotiate and to come together on some kind of peaceful coexistence or whatever, that the United States scuttled. There was the Sunshine, what was it? The Sunshine Doctrines. And we would have no part of it. No part of it. We're not going to have that country resolve its own differences. So this question of self-determination has to be the bedrock of everything we do in the anti-war movement. This country has no right. And then the hypocrisy of us screaming about the Russians interfering in our election. We are going down. If other countries don't elect who we want, we do. Regime change, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And now they're going after Venezuela, who has a democratically elected president. And they removed, what's his name in Honduras? Yeah, so let's not talk about who's interfering and who's elected. Thank you.
So how many of you turn to some kind of foreign media to get your news? Can you maybe shout out which ones?
Al Jazeera.
BBC.
Al Jazeera.
BBC.
BBC.
Telesur.
Telesur. What?
Telesur, right.
Al Jazeera.
Oh yeah, the Intercept.
The Guardian. Well, Intercept is U.S. For
That tells you something right there. Yeah.
So isn't that interesting that so many people turn to foreign sources, which is a great thing. I mean, we really do have to look at the world from outside our own borders oftentimes to see not only what's going on the outside, but see what's going on in here. But it is sad that many of us feel we have to turn to outside media to actually just get news. And I put on a lot of the cable news just to see what it is, and I just get so disgusted by it. On CNN, it's sensationalism, so it'll be hurricane until it's the next thing. And of course, they love war. I mean, war is great sensation for them. And I feel like MSNBC and Fox News are the reflection of each other.
Right.
Kind of.
Absolutely.
And sometimes I prefer watching Fox News just to see what other people are thinking. So, I mean, it is good to get a spattering of news from different places, but it is so sad that we don't feel that in the mainstream media we can either get news enough of what's happening, or we can get it from a perspective that is not a corporate-dominated perspective. And the other is when we organize events. I know, Eugene, we organize events all the time. Who are most of the media that come to cover our events? They are some of these same ones that we just mentioned. They come to cover our events. It's been a long time since we've had CNN out to our events. They used to come. It's been a long time since we've had just, you know, the mainstream media coming out. And that's, I'm particularly talking about anti-war events, because they do come out to things like DACA, and they're coming out to, you know, some of the other things that are domestic focused. But it's really hard to get the anti-war issues covered. I used to be kind of a regular on Fox News during the in the ends of the Bush times, and then in the beginning of the Obama years. And they liked me under Obama because I would criticize Obama. But then I got axed out. I have never ever been on MSNBC. Never. Now, I'm somebody who travels all the time to war zones. You know, Afghanistan, Yemen, North Korea, you name it. I can't even get on MSNBC. You know, that's pretty sick. And the commentators they have on for Afghanistan, for example, those people don't even go to Afghanistan. The commentators they have to talk about Yemen, they don't go to Yemen. The ones that have been talking all this time about North and South Korea, most all of them have never been to North Korea. So we try to get on the networks, and it is very, very hard to do so. And yet it is this dichotomy, this contradiction, that you have our voices, which are the voices that resonate with the majority of American people, and that would resonate even more if we had a chance to reach them on a much larger level, are the ones that the mainstream media wants to cut out from dialogue.
Absolutely. I want to ask one more question. We'll keep this one quick so we can get to your questions, maybe 2 minutes each. I know that it can be very defeating for people to try and tackle, as an activist, something so broad as ending the war machine, or bringing peace to even just one country, to stop us from bombing even just one country. So I wanted to hear from each of you. Either what you would say to someone who asked about that, or an example of an action that you feel had an impact.
I mean, it's a fairly easy question. I mean, I always just point people to history. I mean, most people didn't imagine slavery would ever fall either. And I'm pretty sure, when Harriet Tubman and people were running through swamps late at night through torchlight with dogs chasing behind them, they weren't thinking about how easy they had it. And they probably, to some degree, weren't thinking about how they could ever win. I mean, it was a really small number of slaves that ever revolted or ran away or anything of that nature. And certainly many people who were against slavery resigned themselves to the existence of the institution for hundreds of years because of the intrinsic nature of slavery to the rise of American capitalism. Many people thought it couldn't live without it. Now, maybe American capitalism can't live without militarism and imperialism, and I'm okay with that. But certainly the United States of America and the world can not only survive, but would thrive if we ended imperialism and militarism. So it's sort of like what your parents say when you're a kid, that nothing worth doing is easy to do. And so certainly there's a significant number of challenges, and we face a huge amount of challenges, but every great thing that we look to in history, the books that we have on our shelves that we read to inspire us, all of those things started off from very similar points in time where no one really thought that there was any chance that any of this was ever going to happen, and people on faith alone were like, well, it's the right thing to do, so we're going to do it, and they ultimately succeeded. So I think it's often about even remembering the things that we use to inspire us, that those people were often in the same boat.
I have to say a long journey begins with one step. And I think unity is the key. And we have to work on that. And we have to subordinate our individual agendas to a broader picture of ending the war and attacking the general military budget. And this can be done. I have faith in the American people. And I think that what they're seeing now is a divided left. And it's really rather sad. You have numerous socialist organizations, you have numerous anti-war organizations, but they aren't working together. And that's what made it click in the 60s, and I want to keep stressing that. But as far as to go back a minute to the media, you'll see what they did to Jill Stein's campaign. That was a total blackout.
Yeah.
And I think that the capitalists and the corporate powers understand the power of the Green Party and Jill's campaign far more than our left does. Because they know that if they let her on once a month even, that there would be a huge mushrooming in the Green Party.
Yep.
Now, just think what they did to Bernie. They gave him limited press coverage, but they gave him press coverage. He had more than any of your left organizations, correct?
Yeah.
And look what happens.
Boom!
Boom! With that little prejudicial window that they gave him, look what happened. So they know, don't let Jill Stein and Jama Baraka even get to any major outlet ever. And they killed her in the media. And in spite of that, she turned it around and did a wonderful internet campaign and made the most of it and raised millions of dollars for the first time. So we can do it. We can do it. But any party that is formed, any third party that is formed, is going to come up. All the blocks that are in the way of the Green Party, whether it's ballot access, media access, disruption by Democratic Party operatives and what you're doing, which is extensive. Don't underestimate prototype activities. So, you know, when people dismiss the Green Party, don't be so quick. You're going to face the same things. And we have the experience, so that's all I can say. Thank you.
I want to give the example of the Iran nuclear deal because it was so exciting to be part of that campaign, and because the opposition included the largest foreign policy lobby in the United States, and that is AIPAC. And AIPAC was seen to be more powerful than the president. And AIPAC had not only money, but let's be real, AIPAC has grassroots. You go into any community, major city around this country, and you will find AIPAC or AIPAC-related groups. They organize well. And they have Congress in their pockets because they organize well. And yet, despite that, AIPAC was against the deal with Iran because the Israelis didn't want the deal. Saudi Arabia didn't want the deal and was throwing a lot of lobby money around, and yet we managed to get that through a very good grassroots organizing campaign. Together with, we happen to have an administration that wanted the deal. That helps. So it is an example of how the big lobby can be defeated. It is also an example of saying we better hold on to that deal for our dear lives because Trump wants to get rid of it. One other thing I wanted to bring up when we talk about the difficulties of that we have to overcome to get to the accomplishments Some of them are within our own movement. I'm really glad that Linda keeps bringing this up, and I like the idea when you say we have to pressure our own movements to work with each other more. We have to pressure organizations that are not, that are more the umbrella kind of groups like Our Revolution, to put the anti-war movement into the platform. And sometime, like when you look at some of these big mobilizations, one of the reasons is not only the Democratic Party doesn't want this highlighted, it's also some of the unions. And among the strong unions are the machinists. And the machinists make a lot of weapons. And they do not want to be part of a coalition that has a plank against war. So let's remember, even within the working class and the unions that we need so much to be on the forefront of the kind of changes we want to see, we also have to work within those movements.
All right, I'd like to open it up to you guys. If you can try and keep your questions short, that would be great. I noticed your hand first.
Thanks, Lee. So, as an IBAW guy, love you all, okay? But criticism. So the historical nostalgia, when you talk about the 1960s as being, you know, so much bigger than today, you're doing a real disservice there. KRS-One talks about how we stand on the shoulders of giants, but we look down on them. I mean, in some ways, like Chomsky talks about, we're a much more civil society today. We started, I mean, in Seattle, we had 70,000 people, you know, before the Iraq War started. I was in London, 2 million people before I was into Baghdad. And then, yeah, when I got out as a member, before IBAW, and I'm talking as an Iraq veteran against these wars, we're doing these marches and these rallies, and there's not a lot happening. It's a very disempowering just to talk about doing a march and a rally. The most success we had in the peace movement was in dynamic direct actions. When we, for example, did the sit-in in Senator Cantwell's office for 48 hours, I saw a measurable change in her rhetoric. And we see it also with these town hall actions earlier this year with Trump, that has an impact when people actually forcefully get in these people's faces and do dynamic direct actions as opposed to just having a parade and a rally. And the media ignores those. And I've seen this with my organizing and foreclosure and doing bank eviction blockades too. We have to do something that is powerful and energetic, dynamic, and the media does pay attention. They don't ignore that because it's juicy. And I've seen that influence City Hall. When you talk about being effective again, it's not just about bringing lots of people together to have a parade. It's also about doing dynamic, direct actions. I also want to push back on this idea of the information, right? You had the news.
I will need a question soon.
You guys can respond to it however you want. We have a lot of this information, a lot of the violent imageries out there on the internet. But a lot of people are still looking at cats or in hate groups or in their little echo chambers. It's not actually just productive to read all the right books. You also have to do something with it. So, you know, I think just looking at this idea that we have the information out there and available. I mean, I worked with Move On once, and they had, well, you get this group, this action we want you to run, and you got 500 people or something like that that are going to show up on the event. It's a Facebook event, right? There's 3 or 4 people that show up. I mean, you have to actually have real networks, real bases, real relationships in the actual world, not just the virtual world. And so organizing is so critical in us having our own bases and not just building giant coalitions that don't actually represent real people that have real relationships.
No, I think that's to me, so I didn't mean to say it's either or, okay? It's just that what's lacking right now is the mass actions. And the thing that mass actions do is give people a sense of their own power and that they are not isolated. And the fact that what people love is unity. if there's discord, and I'm sure you've all been, I don't care whether it's a church or a left organization, if there's discord, people, they split. They're out the door.
Yep.
If they see unity,
Yes.
they flock to it. And this has been proven to me over and over again. Now, let me say, we've come out of a terrible period over the last 30, 40 years of neoliberalism. We're entering a period of upsurge again. I was in the Boston Common when 40,000 people were there, and if you want to see people that began to feel a sense of their own power, 40,000 in one city was very impressive. And that was done in a very short period of time. But they were attracted by the unity. There were a whole bunch of organizations sponsoring that. And people like that. They like unity. So this is something that we have to go for. And it's something that is very attractive. And in periods like the period we're coming out of, the tendency is for the movement to fragment. When you start entering a period of upsurge, fortunately, the tendency is for people to come together. And I think that's what we're seeing here, and we're going to start seeing it everywhere.
I mean, I'll just say 30 seconds. I hear you, but I have to say, actually, I don't think I do agree. You know, I can say this. The media ignores a lot of direct actions. So do politicians. And I think that the biggest mistake we make as the left is we argue about tactics as if we're arguing about strategy. And I don't think that we have a key distinction between the two. And I raise that because if you look at any successful liberation movement, you will find within them all tactics. And the example I always use of this is India, because everyone knows of Gandhi. But a few years ago, when they did a poll of who are the most popular Indians, Gandhi was not first. And in fact, ahead of Gandhi was Bhagat Singh. Now, Bhagat Singh is very well known there in India, not known at all around the world, and he's considered a lesser figure because he bombed trains and threw grenades and things like that. But amongst Indians, he was seen as one of the key figures that really raised the issue of Indian liberation to a huge movement. You also had the communist movement at that time that was not really affiliated with Bhagat Singh or with Gandhi. They were primarily focused around how they used strikes and things like that. So when the British looked at India, they didn't say, man, you know what we just hate, like this one guy or this one group or this one thing. They said, man, these Indians are completely ungovernable, and there is nothing we can do about that, and everything we've tried seems to have completely failed, and no matter what we do, they find some new way to come at us that we didn't expect, that is electrifying the world and drawing their attention to us. So you know what? We're going to leave. And especially we're going to leave because we don't want the other colonies to see that they can also become free. So maybe if we get out of this one quickly, I think we could say the same thing about the civil rights movement. A lot of great new books that are coming out, like That Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. You know, The Hands on the Freedom Plow, which is a collection of women who were in SNCC. Unbelievable book. Very interesting history about how they combine nonviolent tactics, self-defense, direct action, mass protest, lobbying in Congress, running politicians, sometimes supporting terrible politicians. The upshot of the civil rights movement wasn't that they found one great tactic, but that they were able to find, and sometimes even in disunity, create a bulk of tactics that for the occupier, for the opposite force, they hate all the people. They hate all the tactics. And so when they all add up to a completely uncompromising, unovercomable, untamable, ungovernable whole, then they move and then they change things. It's not because of one thing, it's because they feel like they're losing control. And I think recognizing the importance of civility and the status quo to people in power is extraordinarily crucial. And we have to talk about strategy, which is how do we create counterpower. And we have to talk about tactics, but way too often I think we're arguing about tactics and thinking we're talking about strategy.
Shout out and thank you, as a vet, for speaking out against wars, and thank IVAW, which is now called About Face, right? And Veterans for Peace, who is another great group doing work on this.
Hi. You mentioned unity as being a key to movements in the past, and you also mentioned government intervention destroying a lot of that. So I would really like to hear from the panel if you have ideas, strategy, tactics for, as we're building our peace movement, how we can counteract these interventionists that are coming to make us think that we're not as unified as we really are.
She's suggesting we have 2 questions on deck, so
Okay.
Smart.
so go ahead and then we'll answer both of them.
I also have a question about unity, but there's been a lot of talk of unity. But I think the most important fundamental question when we're talking about unity is what we're uniting around. I mean, this conference is calling on people to make a third party uniting the left, simultaneously begging Bernie Sanders, a Democratic Party politician, to lead it up. I mean, Bernie Sanders was and gave enthusiastic support for the Obama administration's foreign policy. He said the Iraq-Syria war was the right thing to do. He supported U.S. interventions going to Kosovo. He said during his campaign he was prepared to take the country to war. He endorsed Hillary Clinton, who's a war criminal. Orchestrated the 2009 coup in Honduras that was mentioned. We're talking. I do agree that there's massive anti-war sentiment. And where is it? I mean, quite possibly it's because we're calling on people and the left to unify around the war criminals, people who are very integrated in the political establishment. I mean, so my question is, how is it that a movement like this, again, begging Bernie Sanders to be at the head of it, plans to be anti-imperialist? Why is there no talk of the real driving force of war, which is the capitalist system?
Yes.
Why is there
Yes.
no talk of actually genuine socialism, internationalism, not just the American working class, but the working class of all countries?
I'll deal with the question of disruption, I guess was your question. I feel very strongly, because I've seen it everywhere over 50 years, in every organization you go into. I think the key is that every single meeting ought to have conflict resolution training. And I'm not personally a trainer, but I've been through it, and I think we have to become trainers. And the reason I say that is because most of the conflicts that happen in the movement are unnecessary. In fact, conflict resolution teaches you that conflict in general is unnecessary if you respect that there are going to be differences, okay, and disagreements. And it's okay, and it's healthy, and it's actually it makes us strong. And what that does is that everybody's acting collaboratively and peacefully. Then the disruptors stand out like sore thumbs.
Yes.
Absolutely. And they look really crazy. But if they get us riled up and we start joining in the craziness, that's when the organizations fall apart. On that last question on Bernie, and I think you have to draw a line and no support to Democrats myself. The Green Party has that position. We're strong on it. The Green Party has been moving to the left radically over the last few years, and a whole new layer of Bernie people have come into the Green Party that are pushing it even further to the left and diversifying the party. And it has taken a platform position that we are eco-socialist, which was a step forward for the Green Party. And there's a socialist consciousness that we must change the system. So I see it as the umbrella, quite frankly. And I challenge anyone here to go online and look at the platform of the Green Party and see it includes everything that we want and need. It's all there. The work is done. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Thank you.
Well, I think good questions. As to the last question, I actually don't think that's true. I mean, I haven't been at this conference except for this panel, so I can't tell you what's been discussed here, but I don't think it's true at all to say that there's no discussion in the United States of genuine socialism or revolution or the Democrats or any of that conversation. I mean, I'm someone who became politically active and starting to look into socialism in like 1998. And then, there were almost no people to talk to about that. I would say 3 times